Welcome to another episode of In the Studio. I'm Joe Potter with Vintage Underground.
I'm Alex Haugland with the Haugland Collection.
This is a car that I really like and always have, this series, the Series 1, Series 2 XJs. Let's talk a little bit about what this car is, what these cars are.
So the XJ series, there's really two different variants. There's the XJ6 with a straight 6-cylinder engine, and the XJ12 with Jaguar's V12 engine that they introduced in the 1970s. They were the bread and butter car for Jaguar from the 70s up into almost the 90s.
Well, the Series 1 came out what? Like
Series 1 came out in 1970, I believe.
Like
70,
right
71.
Yeah.
And then the Series 2, I think, was about 74, if I remember correctly.
Were there Series 1s that had 12s in them?
I mean, the first car to get the 12-cylinder sort of naturally was the Jaguar E-Type as a sports car and things like that. And they were looking at putting it into other cars as they went down the road. But it's just such a big engine and things. And with fuel crisis and all of that, there was a lot of push on whether or not they should actually really kind of continue developing it and continue using it for things like this, for just a passenger car.
Well, because the 12, the flathead 12, didn't have the greatest reputation for fuel mileage.
No,
it was
actually
pretty horrendous, actually.
Pretty poor fuel economy. They did a major revision of the cylinder head design in what they call an HE cylinder head, which actually greatly improved fuel economy, but sort of limited the maximum power. So it made it a good option for cars like this, but not as good an option for sort of a true sports car, more like what they were trying to do with the E-Type.
Right, and when I say flathead too, I mean if you pull the alloy head off that engine, it's actually
it still has a single overhead cam on the head, but it's a flat surface.
There's no chamber.
So
the chamber's is actually in the piston, but on the HE head there actually is. There's a double recessed thing. It was actually this clever little. It was a clever design.
Your other option is a 6-cylinder, which is essentially the same engine that Jaguar first released in 1948 in the Jaguar XK120, and is a fabulous engine. I mean, it's a twin-cam, hemispherical combustion chamber, straight 6, and originally started as a 3.4 liter, and then they've had a range of different sizes and things up to 4.2, which is what's in these.
These were always 4.2s, I think.
These were always 4.2s.
Were there home models that were smaller?
There were. I think they had 3.4 liter. I think they even had like a 2.4. I'm not sure if that's technically a 6-cylinder.
I know I had a Mark II that had a 2.4 in it at one time, so I know they had that engine.
Yeah. But I think that they also had a 2.4 version of the XJ6, essentially.
The 60s were kind of a busy, I don't know, too many models.
There was I mean, at the very beginning of the 60s, I think you were still building what became called the Mark I after. Never was actually officially called that, but the 3.4 liter saloon. And then the Jaguar Mark II came out, the Jaguar S-Type came out, the 420 came out, the 420G, which was a rebadge of the larger Mark X, all kind of in the same market segment, slightly different sizes, slightly different configurations. And then finally, those pretty much all went away in 1968 with the designing of this. 1968 was the last year for most of those models, 68, 69.
Because they were, like the Mark X is huge.
It's big. It was the widest car ever built in Britain when it came out. And it was basically geared at the American market. Almost all of them had automatics. This car, XJ6s in the US market, always originally had automatics. I've since put a 5-speed manual in this. It is the single best change I could have ever made to this car. I mean, the automatics are okay. I own a Series 1 4-door, this Series 2 coupe, and a Series 3 4-door. All basically the same engine, same basic general body design. They're all fantastic cars to drive in their own right. But the manual transmission in this really has transformed it.
These were still the Borg-Warner 3-speed.
Yeah, BW65, BW66 gearbox, 3-speed. Its shift points seem to always be off where you want to be. It takes forever to rev up. Once it revs up, it's okay. But
well, I think they were
highway
robust.
Cruiser. They're robust, and it was a good highway cruiser engine in a lot of ways. But it
robust,
wasn't really
but uninspired.
Exactly.
I mean, I actually drove a Series 1 E-Type that had that 3-speed. Automatic in it.
Yeah, that'd probably be a BW35, I think. But
that was a soul-sucking experience. Yeah.
For a lot of people, they like swapping in things like a 700R4 gearbox in place of the 3-speed to get you a 4th gear automatic and things like that. I think there's some advantage to that. But honestly, the coupe really lends itself well to feeling more like a sports car in a lot of ways, a GT car, true GT car.
Right.
And that manual transmission is what really transformed it into that.
Now towards approaching the end of the 60s, they had kind of muddled their product line and kind of got, I don't know if they got off track, but it was certainly muddled and had kind of, for the saloons, had lost the sporting edge of them.
Absolutely.
The design of this, and this was a huge deal when it came out.
This was the car that saved British Leyland. So in the 70s, well, late 60s, 1968, 69, almost every British automotive manufacturer merged under the guise of British Leyland. And when that happened, they basically combined Jaguar. They combined Jaguar with every single competitor it had in the market at the time, with Rover, which was their big English competitor. They merged Triumph with MG, two major competitors and things like that. Austin Morris was also competing against Triumph and some of the other brands.
A lot of people don't know that when that was going on,
yeah.
it would have been the equivalent in the States of one entity combining Chrysler, GM, and Ford into one company in a very short period of time.
And then saying play along, with each one maintaining their own individual management.
Yeah.
And each one having a seat on the board of the parent organization too. So I mean, it's just a horrible situation. But at the time, in the early 70s, the British car industry was so heavily plagued with strikes and things. That's actually, unfortunately, what sank a lot of Jaguar's reputation in that era, was just the build quality went to hell because of the strikes and the way they were putting it together. But at that time, every branch of Leyland pretty much was losing money except for Jaguar because the XJ6. Right. And they literally couldn't build them fast enough.
Well, it was a really, I remember reading, some of the magazines of that era. This was a big deal with this car. And it was kind of that one of those moments where it's like, ooh, they nailed it.
Absolutely.
And the design was stunning, and it was modern, and it was cool.
And generally, it did it all pretty well. Unlike some of the other attempts that they made to try and break into other sectors of the market, this really was a great car, and it's one that you could get in, you could drive for hours, and you get out and you feel comfortable and refreshed because it's such a nice driving experience.
Yeah, they're entertaining cars, and they're heavy. I mean, it's not certainly, I don't think you could call it a sports car. In the coupe version here, it's a nice tourer. And certainly there's things you can do to them to make them a little less plush or soft, I guess. Just a little bit stiffer suspension and of course the manual gearbox. There's things you can do to really kind of bring them alive. But a lot of people really liked the fact that these were a luxury car.
Yeah.
That they are dead smooth, quiet, and nice driving cars. Yeah. I mean, especially compared to but at the time, what would have been a Chevy, I don't even know, Impala or something. I mean, it was a hell of a lot more responsive car than what the typical American driver would.
Handles better than a Cadillac.
Yeah.
Things like that. I mean, Cadillac was really probably their bigger American competitor at the time.
Yeah.
Things along that line, sort of that end of the market.
Probably in that price range.
Yeah,
that's who they were competing against. Yeah.
But this it feels like a much more sporting car than American cars, most American cars that time period.
Well, let's talk about why this coupe exists and what they were doing.
So William Lyons, who was the CEO of Jaguar and for quite a while their lead designer, this is one of the last of the cars that he had a hand in designing in a lot of ways, were the XJ6 and 12 and the coupe. And he always wanted to do a coupe. It's pillarless. You roll down this window and it's just completely open to the inside.
It's a gorgeous
very beautiful
greenhouse
and everything. But the issues that they ran into to some extent was keeping the wind noise down with that continuous greenhouse and things like that. So there were some design considerations. And things like, to make the door for this car, they took two front doors from a four-door car, cut them up, extended it, welded them together. And
they did that with the roof.
They kind of did that with the roof too. A lot of the roof is constructed. There are seams in the back of the roof where things were overlaid and things.
So these were not, the coupes were, I don't want to say an afterthought, but they didn't come out until 75?
75 through, I think 78 was the last year that they sold them. I'm not sure they actually made any in 78. But
and they didn't make a whole lot. No, they didn't make hardly any
maybe
of these.
Maybe 10,000 in all, and that's combining 6s and 12s.
And that compared to the total number of XJs in four-door form made, was pretty small part of production.
Absolutely.
On my car that I'm restoring, you can see that weld line.
Absolutely.
So they were fabricating these cars to a certain degree instead of producing them.
So I think the end result is that what it really came down to is that it cost more to build a coupe, but because it only had 2 doors, it sold for less than the 4-door. So it's one of those, why would you actually market this and sell this car? I mean, other than it being pretty.
Marketing now, I think it's probably reversed. The 2-door coupe off the lot is probably a more valuable car because it has a, more sportier, whatever. It's funny, they go to all this effort to make this coupe and then sell it for less.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have been a narrow market already. I love these. One of these has been on my bucket list for a long time, and that's what I'm building now.
Yeah.
I'm not doing a restoration on mine. I'm doing a kind of a custom build. But yours too is not a dead stock car.
No, it's pretty close. Almost everything on this has been rebuilt, to be honest. So it's got a new paint, new interior, new top. A lot of that, it was a good sound car. It was original paint when I got it, but we're starting to get some rust around the vinyl roof and things like that. It's sort of classic problems of cars of this era. In fact, I think our 2 cars came out of the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
So, but very divergent directions that they've gone. So the interior on this was heavily sun faded. The red didn't hold up well. It was more orange at the time. It really was a nice car, but it needed restoration. And the engine had a bit of a tick. So what we decided to do was rebuild the engine, and that sort of launched into redoing the rest of the car while we're waiting on the engine
compartment.
So we did the engine compartment and all of that. And when we rebuilt the engine, we rebuilt it sans a lot of the emissions changes. So this is a high compression engine, 9-to-1. The original was 7-to-1. The low compression spec, essentially, in the 1970s.
The US spec motor.
And in the process, I also put on European bumpers. We did the gearbox swap at that time. I'd actually bought the parts to do the gearbox conversion on my Series 3 and had stored them for a while. And then I bought this, and this was the perfect car to put them on. So much better than Series 3.
This is a Series 2.
Yes.
And so part of that was the introduction of the 5-mile-an-hour bumper.
These big, massive rubber things, essentially.
Which destroyed the looks of so many cars out of that era, because to integrate it required a complete redesign, and you just couldn't pencil that out. You couldn't make that work to accommodate a 5-mile-an-hour bumper to completely redesign the car.
So there's literally shock absorbers built into the body of the car that the bumper was mounted on.
Stuck them on.
And on the rear, even the European cars had the tubes for those shock absorbers built into the body. The front is actually completely different. The hood actually hinges forward on these, as you know. But the hood hinges are where the bumpers mount on the Series 2 cars. So you actually need the European style hood hinges to mount European bumpers, or modify them or whatever, or come up with some kind of solution. They
weren't doing just a world car where the bumpers just went on everything, but they only did it on the US spec ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, because you'll see all the chassis that are American are marked as like a Federal or something like that, tag on them. And and they were having to add that weight, a lot of weight, front and rear for those bumpers, and they had to completely do reinforcements in the doors. These doors are very heavy.
They are.
And so they were adding weight to the car to meet these new standards to an already stout car, and that just messes with your fuel economy even more.
Yeah.
At the wrong time in history,
And that's, I think, part of the reason why you really don't see any V12s. I think they actually stopped selling the V12s in the U.S. during the Series 2s.
Really?
There are very, very few that actually were sold here.
Interesting.
More in Canada and things like that. But I think a lot of it just came down to the fact that with the gas crisis and everything, no one wanted them. So they
were abysmal. I mean, they were like 6, 7, 8 miles a gallon. They were really not good. So these cars in general, and especially in the States, get a bad rap as being electrical this or engines that. It was very common to do swaps in these motor swaps into typically a small block Chevy.
Yep.
I've seen them with small block Fords, but it's pretty rare. And it's a really common thing. And I would argue that most of it came from a lack of knowledge of the equipment.
I mean, the engine that's in here is 220 horsepower. I mean, you compare it to a lot of the engines that were getting swapped in, and it really isn't that bad.
If not going backwards.
If not going backwards. And then you also take into account that it's a straight six, which usually has mountains of low-end torque. Yeah. It's exactly what you want in a car like this to actually drive it. I think most people's sense of this car being a dog is exclusively down to that 3-speed auto gearbox. Yeah. And performance, even with the stock gearbox, isn't that bad. It takes a little while to get up to speed, but it'll get up to speed. And once you get moving, it gets moving.
The one thing I will say, if one of them gets, if they do get hurt, I mean, the transmission was not an issue. It was the same as any American car, as a simple automatic you could rebuild. The engines, if there was an engine problem, they were more expensive to build than a V8. So I could see a failed motor where somebody's going to look at half the price. I mean, that's how it looks on paper.
Yeah.
You know, but I have, and I'm sure you've seen them too. You look at one of these converted cars, and they're a tangle and they're a mess, and you could tell money's been continually dumped in it to try and complete the transfer.
And usually you find the converted car for sale for half of the equivalent value of a really of a standard engine.
Most of them honestly are parts cars.
I mean, the biggest problem to some extent with these motors is that it's a 1948 design. It really has all the maintenance requirements of an engine from the 1940s, even into the 1980s. You have to drive them, you have to maintain them, you have to take care of them.
But they are rock solid. I mean,
it's a very solid engine.
Incredibly stable motors.
But you have to use it. And I think that's where people tend to break down on these, is that you have to take care of it and you have to use it.
Well, and there's that whole thing of maintenance and that you tend a car, and I'll say that that's not been at least back then in the 60s and into the 70s, that car maintenance wasn't as much of a thing as it was, let's say, in the UK. Yeah. Where it was very routine, you know. And matter of fact, and you had to have it inspected. Yeah. And there was none of that existed there, and it doesn't exist a whole lot to this day.
I think there are some states that have inspection type. I mean, not just smog, but also safety inspections. But most states, or most places in the United States, don't. Oregon never has, as long as I've been here.
The concept of continued maintenance on a machine that you're using seems natural to anybody that works on machines, but in the U.S., I'll say that in car ownership, you know, collectively, it was often not a thing, and that harmed these because they would be driven until they were broke instead of maintained.
Exactly.
And then there were costs that could have been avoided, and then you didn't necessarily find a guy that knew how to work on it. Yeah. And which was a problem with a lot of unique brands that were brought into the States during that period.
Yeah. So you started out with a XJ6 coupe like this, essentially.
Yeah, same car.
But you're doing, I mean, very much the same car. Same year, came out of the same collection in Idaho, I believe.
Yeah, and it was a 6-cylinder car, automatic. I think that the factory made 4-speed cars.
They did manual transmission cars outside of the U.S. market.
Yeah, I don't think they ever came here.
Very, very few were made even outside of the U.S.
So, yeah, so both this one and mine are federal cars, and with the automatic. What I'm doing is abnormal. I mean, most of these cars get restored like this, and maybe some subtle modifications to make them really dependable and roadworthy.
Most common is most people don't put the vinyl top back on.
Yeah.
It is a bit of a rust trap. I think it looks great on a white car.
Oh,
on almost any other color, I don't think it fits very well.
I love this black, red, and white, though.
Absolutely.
That really does. Yeah, but you're right. Most people, when they restore them, they take this off, they do the body work on the roof, and make it all white, which I'm doing as well. Yeah. And I think they put this vinyl roof on just so they didn't have to do body work up here, right?
I've heard of a range of things. That is actually what I think is probably the main reason, is that it made it easier to hide the changes that they had to make when they welded essentially two cars together to make the roof line of this one. Yeah. And other claims of like it's for the paint or whatever, the paint at the time, that they're worried about it flexing and cracking. I'm not sure I believe that. I've seen too many other cars of this era that didn't have vinyl roofs that were fine with bigger roof lines.
Well, in building my car, I am stiffening it, and that is one thing about these cars. They do experience scuttle shake. I mean, they do move, which is interesting. I mean, if you look with the pictures like my car when it's disassembled, you have the two towers that the wings sit on, and there's not much in between.
No.
It's open. There's no core structure at the front.
You pull the front bumpers off, the radiator off,
just a big
and the hood off, and basically I think you have got a very thin sheet metal bar at the bottom that just is there to hold the radiator. Everything else just hangs. So it's basically like a giant tuning fork sticking out there essentially to flex and vibrate
with
and everything.
No B-pillar.
Yep.
So you've got torsional movement here. You've got a big open galley up there, so you got torsional movement there. And so they put those, they actually put tie bars, which is a real common thing across the strut towers on modern cars. Guys will do that to tighten them up side to side. They did that from the factory because they were getting so much flex. I think it was popping the hoods open, wasn't it? Yeah. So I'm gonna, on my car again, modifying, I'm going to be putting some safety tubes to tie that together, some seam welding, some safety tubes back in this area below the waistline and whatnot, because these did move. It's not distracting or anything.
I don't notice it driving this down the road, but this is a pretty stock performing car.
Anytime you start pushing a car, you start pushing its power and braking and suspension capabilities. You got to think about the core chassis and what it's going to do under increased forces, which is something I'm having to consider. Which is true of any time you start modifying a car. You just start yourself down a slippery slope of, bigger motor means bigger brakes, means bigger suspension, means,
Well, and like in your case, for example, one of the things I love about these cars that you're getting rid of is the fact that it has the twin gas tanks. It literally has two tanks, one on each side of the trunk. It means you've got this huge, massive trunk with a full-size spare underneath. Very usable trunk.
Yeah.
But it's also huge. It's big, but it creates lots of issues as far as having those two tanks because you have to have switching between them and things like that.
And they're not tied.
And they're not tied together. They're literally two separate fuel systems.
There's a lot of cars out there that have twin tanks that, like Mini did that.
Yeah.
I had a Cooper S, 67 Cooper S, and had the twin 5-gallon tanks, but they have a big tube between them, an equalizer. These don't. They run independent. You have to switch it at the dash. We talk about these cars being well balanced, and this car's heavier than cars we've talked about in the past, but still well balanced. Plenty of power and great torque and really well designed suspension. It has that classic Jag independent rear suspension. They are well balanced cars. I will say, with the exception of that automatic transmission, you could chuck that thing, but as you've done, replace that. And the car is just golden.
Absolutely.
It's like everything was there.
Part of it also was sort of their marketing ploy that they were looking at. In the 1980s with the Series 3 XJ6s and things, the entire marketing scheme was nothing is optional. There were no options because everything was included. That meant you all got the sunroof, you all got the automatic transmission, you got all of the features essentially. Your only option is buying the Van den Plas uptrim model, what in Europe I think was the Daimler. Essentially, they couldn't call it a Daimler here because of competing with.
Right. Well, you mentioned sunroof. Did only the Series 3 had sunroof? Is that right?
All Series 3s had sunroofs. I don't think any Series 2. Maybe some Series 2 had sunroofs.
I don't know. I know it started with I know Series 3s had them, but I know Series 1 didn't. I don't know about. I don't know that.
I don't know if the Series 2 did at all, but
I've thought about in building my car about harvesting a sunroof off of a Series 3. But I think, I was doing the math, I think you run out of space in the roof.
Yeah, this is the last of what they call the short wheelbase models.
Yeah.
The original Series 1 you could get as a long wheelbase and a short wheelbase. Right. And then in, I think, 74, they technically stopped making the short wheelbase except for the coupe. And then everything else was a long wheelbase car.
Yeah, which probably provided the room for the
longer roof line.
Sunroof. Yeah.
Bit more space.
It'd be kind of cool to have, but I don't think there's a way it'll fit.
Yeah,
it's cool. It's the
nice
drop
roof.
Down.
I love it in my Series 3
body
personally.
color. Yeah.
So
very nice. Well, I think that's about all we got. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.